They said a spirit haunted the southern mountains, tall as a tree, eyes glowing like burning coal, and chains that rattled even when the wind was still. But that spirit wasn't born of myth. He was born of man. A man once broken, beaten, and buried alive by a world that called him property. My name was Samuel Carter, and the night I ran from the Ellison plantation, I didn't just escape, I became the nightmare that the South whispered about for generations. I was born under a blood-orange dawn on the Ellison cotton plantation in the lowlands of Mississippi, where the air was heavy with the smell of sweat, iron, and sorrow. They said I came screaming into this world the same way my mother had been screaming when they dragged her to the fields that morning. My father, Daniel, never got to hold me. He was hanged 2 weeks later for raising his hand against a white manual. They buried him near the cane brake without a stone, without a prayer. That was how life began for me. A life measured in lashes, counted by sunrises that brought nothing but labor and pain. From the moment I could walk, I worked. My hands, still small and tender, bled into the soil that would never bear my name. We picked cotton from sunrise to moonlight, every breath filled with dust that scratched our throats raw. The overseer's whip sang through the air like a cruel hymn. We didn't talk about freedom. We talked about surviving the next hour. Master Jonathan Ellison was a man of fine education and sharp cruelty. He believed himself merciful because he didn't kill for sport, only for discipline. He'd stand on the veranda in his white coat, sipping brandy while the overseer, Hank Braddock, dealt punishment. Miss Clara, his wife, was a ghostly woman who walked the halls with perfume and venom. Her eyes were sharp enough to cut, and she took a twisted delight in seeing men kneel. The quarters where we slept were wooden coffins that barely kept the rain out. The nights smelled of smoke, sweat, and misery. But sometimes, under the stars, when the air was still, the elders would hum the old songs, softly, secretly, as if each note might summon the Lord himself. Those were the moments I felt something stir inside me. It wasn't peace. It wasn't faith. It was defiance, quiet, patient, waiting for a spark. I was 15 when I first tasted the whip. Braddock caught me looking toward the northern tree line during harvest. He said I had runaway eyes. The punishment lasted until my back was a map of open wounds. I remember the smell of my own flesh burning under the sun, the laughter of the other men, forced to watch so they'd remember what freedom cost. But instead of breaking me, that pain hardened into something unyielding. Each scar became a memory, and each memory became a reason. I learned to hide my anger the way I hid the small pieces of bread I stole from the kitchen, carefully, silently, for survival. By the winter of 1843, whispers started spreading through the quarters. Someone had escaped from a plantation further east. They said he followed the river north into the mountains, where no master's horse could climb. The patrols hunted him for weeks, but found nothing but footprints and a broken chain. Some said he froze to death. Others said he became part of the mountain itself. That story burrowed deep inside me. I began to study the stars whenever I could, pretending to relieve myself outside while memorizing their patterns. I learned where the dogs roamed, when the guards changed, and which nights Miss Clara took her laudanum early. I never told anyone, not even Ruth, the woman I loved, who slept beside me on the dirt floor, her hand resting on the scar over my ribs. I couldn't risk it. Freedom was a secret too sacred to share. Every night, I'd whisper to the darkness, "Lord, if you give me a sign, I'll take it." And one Christmas Eve, when the sky turned black and the first cold rain began to fall, that sign came. The river swelled. The fields flooded. The dogs were chained inside the barn. The world, for once, was louder than my heartbeat. And that was the night the South lost its most obedient slave and found its most feared man. The night I decided to run was the night I learned what true cruelty looked like. The kind that doesn't roar or scream, but smiles while it kills you. I remember the air. It was thick with smoke from the feast the Ellisons were hosting at the big house. Christmas had come, and with it, the illusion of kindness. The masters drank, the mistresses sang, and we, the invisible hands that made their world turn, were allowed scraps from their table as a gift. But even as the laughter echoed from the veranda, there were cries in the yard. Hank Braddock had caught one of the young boys, Eli, no more than 12, sneaking a piece of cornbread from the kitchen. That small, starving child was dragged before the guests like an offering. I can still hear the sound of Miss Clara's voice, sweet as poisoned honey, saying, "Discipline him here. Let them all learn." And so, Braddock did. Under the glow of lanterns and laughter, he whipped that boy until the world seemed to stop spinning. Every crack of leather against flesh was followed by cheers from men too drunk to notice they were watching a child's soul being torn apart. I stood at the edge of the field, fists clenched, body trembling. The rain began to fall again, soft at first, then harder, until it drowned the sound of Ellie's screams. He didn't move when it was over. Miss Clara ordered his body taken to the smokehouse, as if the sight offended her delicate senses. That was when something inside me finally snapped. For years, I had believed the elders who said patience was the only weapon a slave could wield. But patience felt like poison now. The image of that child's lifeless body burned itself into me, and for the first time, I wanted something more than freedom. I wanted justice, the kind of justice the earth remembers. The following days were filled with a silence that felt unnatural, like the world itself was holding its breath. Braddock walked among us with his whip coiled at his side, proud of the lesson he had given. He caught my eye once, and I saw amusement there, as if he knew I hated him but would never dare speak. He was wrong. I didn't need to speak. I only needed to wait. That night, I returned to the smokehouse. The smell of meat and death hung in the air. I lifted the burlap covering and looked at Ellie's still face. His eyes were closed, peaceful now, free in the only way the South allowed us to be free. I placed my hand on his chest and swore, under my breath, that he wouldn't be the last to leave this world on his knees. From that moment, everything I did was with purpose. I began collecting what I would need: a small blade stolen from the workshop, flint for fire, and food hidden beneath loose floorboards. I watched the guards change shifts, memorized the rhythm of their footsteps, and studied the dogs' habits. I could hear them breathing at night from across the yard, the sound of my hunters waiting. During the day, I played the part of the obedient slave. I smiled when ordered to, bowed when spoken to, even laughed when Braddock made his cruel jokes. But inside, I was sharpening my resolve. I could feel the mountains calling me, their peaks hidden behind clouds, their silence promising something better than breathless obedience. Then, one evening, as the sun died red across the horizon, Braddock cornered me near the stables. He said he'd heard I was too clever for my own good. His breath reeked of whiskey as he struck me, again and again, with the butt of his rifle, until my mouth filled with the taste of iron and dirt. I fell to my knees, but my eyes never left his. That was my mistake. He saw defiance in them, and for that, he dragged me to the whipping post. The blows came faster this time, deeper, until I lost count. When it was over, my back was a sea of open fire. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. But as Braddock walked away, laughing, I swore that he would never lift that whip again. The next morning, I was sent back to the fields. Every movement tore at my wounds, but I refused to fall. I saw Miss Clara watching from the veranda, her pale face calm, her eyes like polished stones. She smiled. Perhaps she thought the beating had tamed me. But she couldn't see what was building beneath my silence. The storm was already coming, and when it broke, no prayer, no master, no chain on earth would be strong enough to hold it back. The night the storm broke felt like the earth itself had decided to rise against its masters. The sky was black as burnt coal, thick clouds rolling across the moon like soldiers marching toward war. I remember the sound of thunder. It came from far away at first, like a whisper from heaven, then closer, louder, until it shook the walls of the slave quarters. Each rumble made the boards beneath me tremble, and in that trembling, I felt the pulse of something ancient and wild. Freedom had a heartbeat that night, and it was pounding through the rain. I could barely stand from the beating Braddock had given me days before, but pain had become something familiar, something I could wear like a second skin. I had spent my life enduring what would kill most men, And now I understood why. Every scar, every lash, every humiliation had been preparing me for this moment, the moment I would stop being the hunted and become something far more dangerous. The others slept, huddled together for warmth, their breaths shallow and uneven. I watched them for a long while, the flickering light from the dying fire dancing across their faces. These were my people, bound to the same misery I was about to flee. Part of me wanted to wake them, to tell them to come with me, to run into the storm and never look back. But I knew what the cost would be if we were caught. I couldn't risk more lives. Freedom, for me, would begin alone. I reached beneath the loose board under my cot and retrieved the knife I had hidden, a small blade, rusted, dull at the edge, but mine. I tied a piece of torn cloth around its handle, the same piece that had once belonged to my mother. Her scent, faint now but still there, filled my chest with something like courage. Around my waist, I strapped the small pouch of food I had gathered, dried meat, a few biscuits, a sliver of salt pork, and a piece of flint wrapped in rags. The rain had started to fall heavier now, a curtain of sound that covered everything. I waited until the guards changed posts, one walking toward the barn, another heading toward the main gate, and then slipped out into the darkness. The first breath of free air hit me like fire. It was cold, sharp, and alive. My feet sank into the wet mud, and the world around me became soundless except for the steady rhythm of my heartbeat. I moved toward the barn, where I knew Braddock slept. I could have kept walking. I could have left him to his whiskey and nightmares. But the thought of Ellie's body, small and still under that burlap sack, held me in place. Some chains don't hang from iron, they hang from memory. And that memory demanded blood. Inside, the barn was dim, lit only by a single lantern swaying from the beam above. Braddock lay on a pile of hay, his whip coiled beside him like a sleeping snake. His snores were loud and ugly. For a moment, I just stood there, knife in hand, watching him breathe. My fingers trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of choice. I thought of my father's body hanging from the oak tree, of my mother's voice whispering prayers that went unanswered, of every lash, every scream, every plea that turned to silence. Then I moved, slowly, purposefully. The blade slid across his throat with barely a sound. His eyes opened for a second, confusion flashing across them, then nothing. The lantern light flickered, catching the blood as it spread across the hay. It smelled of rust and rain. I didn't look back. I took the whip from beside him and cut it in half, dropping it into the dirt. When I stepped outside, the rain had turned the world silver. Lightning lit the fields, and for an instant, I saw the cotton swaying like white ghosts waving goodbye. My feet carried me to the river, the one the runaway had spoken of before they hanged him. It was swollen, dark, and violent, but I didn't stop. The water was freezing, dragging me down with every step. My lungs burned, my limbs screamed, but the thought of chains kept me moving. I reached the far bank gasping, my body shaking, my heart hammering. Behind me, the plantation was just a blur of firelight and thunder. Ahead, the forest waited, tall, ancient, and silent. I crossed the line between life and legend that night. I wasn't Samuel the slave anymore. I was Samuel the free. But freedom, I would soon learn, doesn't end with escape. It begins with what you're willing to become to keep it. The storm swallowed me whole, and as the thunder rolled across the hills, I vanished into the darkness, one man against the whole of the South. The mountains rose before me like the bones of God, towering, endless, cloaked in mist and shadow. Every step I took away from the plantation felt like a step deeper into another world, one untouched by chains, one where no man called another master. The air was cold and sharp, cutting through my lungs with every breath. But that pain was clean. It was mine. For the first time in my life, my suffering belonged only to me. Days blurred into nights, and nights into a silence so vast it almost swallowed thought itself. I moved like an animal, drinking from streams, eating roots and berries, sleeping under trees that creaked like they were whispering secrets of the dead. I'd built a small fire once, but the smoke rose too high, too bright, and I realized quickly that warmth was a luxury the hunted couldn't afford. From then on, I let the cold become my companion. It wasn't long before I saw the first sign that they were coming. Footprints, too heavy for the forest floor, crushed into the mud near the riverbank. The overseer's blood wasn't cold before the master sent his men after me, 5 in total, armed with rifles, dogs, and the law itself. Their reward posters hung in nearby towns, I heard later, though I never saw one myself. I didn't need to. I could smell their pursuit. At night, I could hear the hounds baying far below, the sound echoing through the valleys like church bells for the condemned. But I had something they didn't: patience. The same patience they'd beaten into me year after year now became my weapon. I watched them from the ridges, studying their movements, learning their habits the way I once learned the overseer's footsteps. Each time they came close, I moved higher, deeper, until the mountain became my shield. Then came the first encounter. It was near dawn, a pale mist crawling across the trees like breath on glass. I saw 2 of them walking below, a big man with a red scarf, and a boy, no older than I'd been when I first took the whip. The boy looked nervous, his rifle shaking in his hands. They stopped to rest near a creek, the older one lighting a pipe. The smell of tobacco carried up through the fog, rich and bitter. I moved without sound, the way wolves move through grass. When the boy turned his head, I struck a rock to the temple. The man dropped his pipe and reached for his gun, but I was faster. The knife found his throat before he could breathe. The creek ran red for a long time after. I left their rifles and took only what I needed: bread, water, and the red scarf. I tied it around my arm as a reminder that I would never again be the hunted. The rest came slower, one by one. They called me a demon, a shadow, a curse sent by the slaves they buried. By the time the last man died, his own firelight flickering against my face, the stories had already begun. They said a mountain ghost roamed the southern ridges, half man, half spirit, draped in chains that sang when the wind blew. Some said he killed only at night. Others swore he could vanish into the trees like smoke. For me, it wasn't about killing. It was about balance. Each death was a piece of the old world dying with them. Every drop of blood that touched the earth felt like an unspoken prayer for the lives that had been taken before mine. Winter came early that year, blanketing the peaks in ice and silence. I built a shelter from fallen logs and stone, small enough to keep in the heat from a single ember. There, I lived like the animals, wild, watchful, alive. But even in that stillness, I could feel the south below me trembling. The Ellison plantation was burning. I saw the smoke rise one morning, thin and gray against the horizon. Maybe lightning had struck. Maybe someone else had done what I could not. Whatever the cause, it felt like the final chain had broken. The mountain became my home. The man who had once bowed in the dirt now ruled over the ridges, unseen, untouchable. The locals began to leave offerings at the edge of the forest: bread, whiskey, bits of tobacco, pleading for safe passage. They feared the ghost of the runaway slave, but they also respected him. Fear and respect, strange gifts for a man who once had neither. And though they spoke of me like a spirit, I was still flesh, still bone, still haunted by the echo of chains. Some nights, I'd wake to the sound of wind through the trees and swear it was the crack of the overseer's whip. I'd rise, heart pounding, knife in hand, before realizing there was no one left to fear. No one but myself. The years that followed turned the world around me into something quiet, something unrecognizable. The shouts, the chains, the fires, all faded into the sound of wind against the mountains. I had escaped the whip, the blood, the plantation. Yet there were nights when I wondered if I had truly escaped anything at all. Freedom, I learned, isn't always peace. Sometimes, it's just silence that no longer answers back. I built a cabin high above the valley, hidden between pines and stone, where no road dared climb. The walls were rough, the floor uneven, but it was mine. I hunted deer, trapped rabbits, and drank from the same stream that once carried the blood of my pursuers. Each sunrise came cold and gold, spilling light across the ridges, and for a moment each day, I would feel alive, truly alive, in a way that no man on the plantation ever could. But then the past would come creeping, as it always did. In the crackle of fire, I'd hear the overseer's voice, sharp as a whip. In the rustle of leaves, I'd hear the cries of those still bound in chains. I'd close my eyes, and their faces would come, the men who'd worked beside me, the women who'd been taken from their children, the songs we'd sung at night when hope felt like sin. Some of them never got to see the morning I now lived in. That truth pressed heavy on my chest. Sometimes travelers would wander near my land, traders, hunters, the lost. They never saw me, but I saw them. I'd watch from the shadows as they spoke of the mountain ghost, their voices low, half in fear, half in awe. They said he burned the master's house, slaughtered his men, and vanished into the woods. They said he carried the souls of the dead in his breath, that his eyes glowed red in the dark. And though I should have felt pride, I only felt distance. I wasn't a ghost. I was a man, one who'd lived through too much to still believe in vengeance as salvation. The stories were bigger than me now, and maybe that was the way it was meant to be. The South needed its monsters. The slaves needed their symbol. I had become both. One winter evening, I found a traveler collapsed in the snow near the ridge. A young man, skin pale as the frost, lips trembling, breath shallow. He'd broken his leg somewhere below. I dragged him to my cabin, tended his wound, gave him broth by the fire. When he woke, his eyes went wide as if he'd seen death itself. "You're him," he whispered, voice trembling. "The ghost of Hollow Peak." I almost laughed, but instead I said, "I'm just a man who doesn't like being found." He stayed 2 days, and before leaving, he asked why I lived alone in the wilderness. I told him the truth, because peace is quieter when there's no one left to take it from you. He nodded, though I could tell he didn't understand. He wouldn't. Few men ever could. He left before dawn, his limp slow but steady, and I never saw him again. But months later, I heard rumors in town, stories of a mysterious mountain man who'd spared a traveler's life. They said the ghost wasn't a killer after all, but a guardian of the lost. The tale changed once again, reshaped by the mouths of strangers. Maybe that was how I'd survive, not as flesh, but as legend. As time passed, I began marking the trees near my cabin with carvings, names of those who'd died in chains, those who'd never escaped. Each mark was a prayer. Each cut a promise that they'd never be forgotten. When the wind blew through the pines, it sounded like their voices humming an old song, the kind we sang when the night was long and the lash was near. One evening, as the sun melted behind the peaks, I stood outside my cabin and watched the valley below fade into gold and shadow. The world had changed, they said. Slavery was dying, freedom spreading, though I doubted freedom ever truly came easy. But still, there was hope, fragile and flickering, like the last ember of a dying fire. I breathed it in, that cold air of the mountains, and I realized something I'd never dared to before. The slave I'd been had died the night I fled. The man I'd become was born in blood, in pain, in solitude, but he lived. And as darkness settled, I whispered to the wind, "Tell them I was not broken. Tell them I lived." There comes a time when a man realizes that his story no longer belongs to him. It slips from his hands, carried away by wind and memory, whispered by strangers who never knew his name but swear they've seen his shadow. I suppose that's how all legends are born, not from truth, but from what truth leaves behind. Years turned to decades, and the world below the mountains began to forget the sound of chains. Children grew up free, not knowing what the word master once meant. The plantations withered, their fields overgrown, their houses crumbling under the weight of history's silence. But even as the South changed its face, I remained here, in the high places where the air was thin and the sky close enough to touch. I had become part of the land, as much a ghost as the men said I was. Sometimes, at night, I'd sit outside and look at the stars, wondering if any of the souls who suffered beside me had found peace among them. I'd talk to them as if they were still here. Elijah, Ruth, little Mary, the ones who never made it beyond the fields. I told them of the mountains, of the rivers that sang instead of screamed, of the cold that burned but never bound. I told them I'd lived for them. The winters grew harsher as the years passed. My hands stiffened, my breath grew short, and I knew the mountain would soon claim me as it claimed the trees and the stone. But I was not afraid. Death had followed me once. Now it walked beside me like an old friend. I sharpened my knife one last time, not for war, but for memory. I set it beside the fire, next to the red scarf I'd taken so many years ago. The color had faded to brown, but the story behind it never did. On the night, I felt my heart begin to slow. The wind rose strong through the pines, carrying with it the low hum of voices, not the cruel bark of overseers, not the cries of the dying, but a song, a slave's song, the same one we used to sing in the dark, soft and trembling. Oh, freedom over me! I closed my eyes, and it felt as if the chains around every man and woman I'd ever known were breaking all over again, one by one, echoing through time. I saw faces, some smiling, some weeping, and in that moment, the mountain wasn't cold anymore. It was warm, alive, pulsing with something I couldn't name. Maybe that's what heaven is for a man like me. Not pearly gates or angels, but peace, quiet, deep, and earned. They say that years after I was gone, wanderers still saw smoke curling from the ridge, though no fire was found. They claimed they heard footsteps crunching through snow, whispers moving through the trees. A few even swore they saw me, tall, dark, wrapped in shadow, standing at the edge of the cliff, looking down upon the valley. Some say I'm still out here, guarding those who seek refuge, guiding the lost back to safety. Others believe my soul was never laid to rest, cursed to walk until every wrong is made right. Maybe both are true, because the past never dies. It lingers in soil, in bone, in the silence between heartbeats. The South may have buried its cruelty, but the land remembers. The rivers remember. The wind remembers. And sometimes, if you stand very still, you can hear it, the faint clinking of unseen chains carried on the breeze, the whisper of a man who once refused to kneel. If you ever find yourself lost in those mountains, and you hear that sound, don't be afraid. That's just me, walking beside you, watching, waiting, reminding the world that freedom, no matter how hard won, is never free. And when you look toward the horizon, and the sun spills gold over the ridges like fire, remember this. I was born in chains. I lived in blood, but I died free. So if the wind should ever whisper my name through the pines, don't speak of vengeance. Speak of endurance. Don't say I was a killer. Say I was a man who dared to climb higher, a man who burned and still rose, a man who became the mountain.